What up, Wizards? It's Dev, Mtg. We like it at Magic, especially on days like this. Because did you know, have you heard, it is the biggest YouTube video of the whole year on the entire platform. That's right, because today is the return of a beloved, legendary series in the annals of MTG YouTube history. Today is the 5 for 5, baby. That's right, 5 decks, $5 a piece. Now, you're right. It has been a little while since the last one of these. Over a year and a half, in fact. Sorry about that. And when I do put them out, I like to put them out around the holiday season. You know, theoretically, good vibes, chilling with family, all that stuff. But this time around, I could not see myself waiting for another 5 months to crawl by before I got this video out of my consciousness. So we're doing it today, and that's fine. It's summer. We're all spending a little bit more time together anyway, doing barbecues, cookouts, pool parties, and all that kind of stuff, carrying a hot dog around in one hand, a cheap Magic deck in the other. Doesn't matter if you smear mustard all over the cards because it's only $5. Who cares? I'm really down a rabbit hole at this point. I have gone off on a tangent. I'm sorry about that. We got to start talking about these decks if this video is going to be an appropriate length of time. So let's go. But Dev, you're not even finished with your intro yet, really. We can tell there's a rhythm to it, and I haven't heard the best song yet. You know, my favorite Magic channel's favorite Magic channel. Everybody loves that part. You're absolutely right. We still got to get to that stuff. So let me use this moment in time, lay out some ground rules for you. There's really only one this time around, but in the past, they were kind of zero. You know, it's just like these decks are around $5, give or take. I just kind of like dust my hands off and walk out the door and leave you with it. You know, it can't be that way anymore, though. Because the last couple of times we've done 5 for 5, Arena has existed. So I keep getting all these comments that are like, yeah, Dev, I know these are 20-cent rares in real life, but a wild card is a wild card, you know? And like on that, I hear you. You're 100% right. So I've introduced a special stipulation this time around to be as pretentious as possible in my terminology. What we're going to do is I'm giving myself a maximum of 4 rare wild slots in every single deck we're doing today. I have now wasted enough of your time on intros. Here's that song you like. And I'm your favorite Magic channel's favorite Magic channel. Best believe that the professor go bananas for my deck tech. And here's that cat you like. And here's some decks that you'll probably like, especially this first one. You know, when I was going through these and I was wondering how best to present these, in what order, what should go first to get the people going and all that stuff, I just really couldn't think of a better one than Mono Green Stompy. I don't think I've ever not put an H in Stompy. I'm feeling Stompy tonight. Gonna get to stomping in my Air Force Ones. There's a bunch of really good cards for this deck right now. It's kind of amazing that it's not at all a thing in Standard, although you see versions of it from time to time on the ladder with some really powerful cards that I'm going to recommend as upgrades a little bit later. But it turns out you don't need that many rares to make this deck work. Now we'll get this monster mash started with 4 copies of Evolving Adaptive, 4 copies of Cankabloom, and 4 copies of Kyrion Dryad. That's right, all 4 rare slots in one card. You'll see an awful lot of that today because I just don't want to play Mono Green Stompy without this card. As a matter of fact, Evolving Adaptive and Kyrion Beastcaller feel like very, very similar cards, and getting started on turn 1 and 2 with them, especially on the play, is how you win games of Magic. And it's no mistake that the Pokemon Cankabloom is in the middle between these two dudes because he's actually kind of sweet with them. Neat trick here. Remember that you can always put the Cankabloom on blocks and then sacrifice him to proliferate and make anything with +1/+1 counters on it a little bit bigger right then and there. Especially these two guys flanking him right now, which are some of the only things in the deck that actually get +1/+1 counters. But Cankabloom can be pretty good with both of them for that reason, but it's also just kind of threatening in and of itself as a 3/2 for 2 mana. Moving on from there, the choices start to get a little bit weirder with 4 copies of Jewel Thief, 4 Sandstalker Moloch, and 4 copies of Notvold Hermit, of all things. Now, Jewel Thief probably doesn't need a whole lot of explanation. You know, 3 mana, 3/3, couple of keyword abilities, a little bit of ramp in our Stompy deck. It's all pretty nice, and it's all 15 cents, so the price is right too, right? I mean, again, this card just makes sense to me. But then we move into slightly weirder stuff with Sandstalker Moloch. Is actually one of the best cards in the entire deck. First thing I need to tell you about this is that within the larger meta, or really the smaller meta of these 5 decks, which are again always tuned to play against one another, this is one of the best cards in the whole, I hesitate to call it meta, right? Because there is not a single deck that we'll look at today besides this one that doesn't have either blue or black in it. Aside from that, there's fun tricks with this thing in the deck, like you can flash it in during combat to grow your Evolving Adaptive or your Kyrion Beastcaller or both. So keep that trick in mind too. Again, a lot of splashy fun stuff you can do with this card in the deck. It's awesome. but not Vald Hermit. Now, I'm not going to lie and say that this is the best 4-drop we have access to in the whole format. It's not. There's better stuff than this, obviously, and we'll talk about it in a second. But for the most part, this actually isn't terrible for like 2 cents or even a penny. I think it's like really, really cheap market price right now. And it is a 4-mana, 4/4. Not the absolute worst stats that you can imagine, right? And if you do flip it over, not only is it then a 5/5, but it makes something else a 5/5 when it attacks. And it makes it base 5/5. So again, you can make that evolving adaptive 5/5, but it's got like 4 counters on it. Same thing with Kyrion Beastcaller. You know, make it a 5/5. It's got 3 counters on it. Suddenly it's huge. So now Vald Hermit is actually pretty cool for punching through late game damage. But we got to move on to the weirdest looking cards in the deck. We're going to play 2 copies of Capenna Express, and then 4 copies of Blossom Prancer. Now, I know you're probably looking at me funny, so I need to quickly explain Capenna Express, right? Because there's a little bit to this card in the deck. First of all, the obvious excuse here is that at this price point and these rarities, there's really not a whole lot of amazing green 4-drops. We need to fill out this slot, right? So there's the first one, but aside from that, card's actually not terrible. In this little like 5-deck meta that we've created, this is the biggest creature, so that matters in terms of combat math, whether you're blanking your opponents from attacking or you're getting attacking with your big old train, right? That's what you want to be doing. But aside from that, it's actually pretty easy to crew this thing. We go Jewel Thief on 3, this on 4, and we got a treasure that can crew it without having to like tap anything. That's pretty cool. But aside from that, basically every creature in this deck is at some point in the game capable of crewing Capenna Express. Evolving Adaptive and Kyrion Dryad can't naturally do it, but they will grow to be able to do it eventually. Now, Blossom Prancer, again, I can't lie to you and be like, this is the best 5-drop in green. It's not. Again, we'll get there in just a second. But between this and Sandstalker Moloch, we have like 8 creatures in our mono-green Stompy deck that are pretty capable, like easily capable of producing some kind of card selection and replacing themselves in our hands. So that is really, really sweet when it comes right down to it. And I did not hate Blossom Prancer. Also, for what it's worth, gorgeous art on this card. I know it ain't worth much, but hey, you're paying 3 cents for a piece of art that you do not mind looking at all the time. So you know, think about it that way. But let's move on to the last few cards in the deck here. We're playing 4 copies of Cosmic Hunger and 2 copies of Master's Rebuke because we need removal spells. It's really all I have to say about these. They're removal spells. Let's play some of those. Deck also plays 24 forests. We're going to keep it simple. Hello again, by the way. It is my head and most of my body. Again, my legs are actually off training for a marathon right now. They've left me floating here in the ether to do these deck techs, but I think I can do it. Whoa, okay, here we go. 24 forests to keep it simple. But before we move on to the next deck, new section alert. Hello, whoa, hey everybody. New section alert. We're going to do maybe the most requested thing in 5for5 history and finally provide you with some upgrades for these decks. Now, I'm only going to give you 1 or 2 per deck because for most of these, I really don't think that there's that much improving to be done. I'm just really good at my job. But for some of these, there's some pretty obvious upgrades, right? Like for this one, sadly, you want to take out the not Vald Hermit that I talked up for a while there. I guess you could take out Capenna Express too if you wanted to. You don't like that card, right? I didn't talk you into it. So just take those out and put in Ulvenwald Oddity instead. That's a great 4-drop. It's got haste and trample and transforms and stuff. Just way better than not Vald Hermit. So maybe play that instead. It's very cheap if you're playing paper like a Magic player. But aside from that, you can also try and play Defiler of Vigor. This is a little bit more expensive than just like a normal old budget card. I can't call it that, but it is much better than Blossom Prancer. If you're going to pay 5 mana, it has 2 extra power toughness and lets you play your other stuff for cheap and puts +1 counters on everything. You play this card if you can do that, but if you can't, deck is fine. But it's on to the next one, everybody. And you know, sometimes I like to look through all the like commons and uncommons, cheap rares and stuff, and just pick one specific card to build a funky, cool deck around. So I was doing that this time around, and I was like, what card? What card should I pick? Oh, how about discard? That's right. Like I've said before, you can be evil on a budget. T-shirt coming soon. Now, the thing with this deck is, if you'll remember just a few videos ago, I was saying that, oh no, discard is a dead archetype in standard. We'll never see it again. What are we going to do? So I set out to prove that it is in fact bad and dead in standard. I built this deck. It turned out to be actually better than I thought it would be. I usually build like 8-9 decks for the 5for5, cut it down to 5 decks, right? I like to have options. When I built this, I was fully convinced there's no way it would end up on this list. But here we are. I'm talking about it right now because the deck actually ended up being awesome. Let's take a look. Now, it starts with 4 copies of The Raven Man and 4 copies of Invasion of Eldraine. Man, I used to underestimate The Raven Man. Nevermore, dude. I am super surprised that this card is only about 15 cents right now. It actually sees play here and there in the odd like Esper Legends deck, and it's just a cool card in general. It's sweet to play on curve before like a turn 3 Liliana. There's just a lot of reasons why I thought this card would be like, I don't know, $1, you know. But once I found out it was 15 cents, I was like, oh, we're making this thing. And this is an amazing engine for the deck. And once you do get 2 or 3 Raven Man birds like flying around up there being annoying, it's really easy to then flip over this Invasion of Eldraine. See how well these 2 cards work together? It's actually a nice little combo. Once you get your Prickle Fairies out, which is a great name for a card, not only is it presumably flying over for a couple of damage a turn, but you're dealing static damage to your opponent every single turn, kind of like the Rack, which is an effect that we don't get a whole lot nowadays, and there's a reason for that. It's an annoying effect that allows discard to actually win games, which is, turns out, what we're doing here. But we got to make him discard cards to get either of these cards doing things. So let's play 4 copies of Virus Beetle and a playset of Corrupt Court Official. These are both like great blockers in the early game, great attackers against certain like control-based lists and stuff like that. They're not too bad at it. They add up damage. And just great little utility cards. We want our opponent to discard, but we also need some bodies. I'm also playing 4 Pilfer and 2 Duress. Now, Duress is self-explanatory. I think basically any discard deck worth its salt needs to play some version of this effect. But Pilfer, my goodness, man, I was not ready for how good this card was. You know, I've been playing games in like the unranked queue with a lot of these decks for a while now just to see what they do. And if you're not against specifically Reanimator, Pilfer is actually a really boss Magic card a lot of the time. You know, you take out the thing that their entire deck is built around. I mean, it's just amazing. This is basically like Thoughtseize on turn 2, and you don't have to pay life for it. And I know there's a massive difference between 1 and 2 mana. It's not Thoughtseize, but this effect, this text box is almost always powerful, even if you had to wait till turn 2 to use it. Pilfer's a decent card. Now, fair warning, we're going to look at a weird one, but it has a lot of reasons for being in the deck. Let's just look at Flitting Gorillas by itself. We're playing 2 copies of this, and I'm going to give you an extra second here and do a little expository talking so that you have some time to read this card, because you did not know this card existed. I am almost sure there is no way that you've paid attention to this card in the past before, unless you're a hardcore limited player. Now, this does a lot in this deck. This is the only thing in the deck that's capable of bringing back either an Invasion or a Raven Man once it's hit the graveyard. That's a super important function. But we can also, since this is a 3-mana 2/2 flyer, we can play this on 3. And then on turn 4, we play Invasion and immediately swing into it with our 2/2 flyer. So it's really easy at turning over our Invasion for us too. Just not a whole lot in the 3-drop slot in this standard that's capable of doing all the things this card does in one card for this deck. So after that, we need to finish off with some removal. So we're playing 4 copies of Go for the Throat, which is amazingly cheap right now at about 30 cents a copy. But there's also 4 copies of Hero's Downfall, which is even cheaper, like 10 cents a copy. And then maybe my favorite of these, the 4 copies of Corrupt to finish off the deck. Really, Corrupt is one of the cards the deck needs the most, and I will die on that hill. You know, there's so many games where you deal a little bit of damage here and there with your birds or your Prickle Fairies or whatever, and you get them down to 8, and you just can't close, right? Well, Corrupt will help you do that in the late games. Just always sweet to draw Corrupt when you have the mana to play it, no matter what you're targeting. Now, there's also 24 lands in this deck. Can you guess what they all are? Now, you could put in like Takenuma in this deck, Boseiju in the first one, but you know, why screw up a good thing? Just put in a basic lands. They're fine. They work. As far as upgrades for this deck, I'm just going to give you the super obvious one. Play Sheldred. Play Sheldred in this deck. You know, I'm sitting here freaking out about Prickle Fairies. It's an extra 2 damage a turn, and so is Sheldred. And sometimes it's worth even more damage than that, and you get to gain the life too. It's like, I know she's like $700 or whatever she's gotten up to this week. I think she's like 70 the last time I checked. But if you want to know what the absolute best card you get out of this deck is, it's Sheldred. I'm sorry that is just the reality of the situation, but that's where we are. But let's move on to my favorite deck of the whole day. You would think it would be discard, especially with how excited I was back there. And I am. I do like the discard deck, but I have got to admit to being way too into blue-white defenders. I said it. I know this isn't like a meeting or an intervention or anything, but I do feel like I need a little bit of help. And that's because I really just cannot get enough Winged Mantle Chaplain. Just directly in my veins, I got to have it every day. Just looking good, looking like Jim Caviezel over here, but it's not the only good card in the deck. We're also playing 4 copies of Shield Wall Sentinel and 4 Walking Bulwark. Now, the Raging Bull down here, right of your screen, really decent card, man. Sometimes this dude feels like a 1-mana 3/3. The threat of activation is really high on this guy. He is surprisingly intimidating to sit across the table from. He's got this aura to him, you know. Just, again, he threatens to make any creature in our deck actually have respectable stats, and you got to kind of like give it to him for that. He's a good little dude. But aside from that, we've also got the Shield Wall Sentinel, which I'm surprised this wasn't worth like $1 a piece or something like that. I just figured that being able to go grab a defender and commander would be worth something, but apparently it's not. So in our deck, this is basically always going to get Wingmantle Chaplain, so I might as well go ahead and skip to WC Fields here. This thing is crazy. You know, if we have like 4 defenders out, this is going to make 4 birds. Doesn't sound like a lot, does it? It kills your opponent super fast. I also kind of like that within the meta of these 5 decks, Wingmantle Chaplain and Raven Man have a little rivalry going on where they're both making birds and stuff. Raven Man's can't block and Wingmantle Chaplain's can, and it's just, they have a little thing going is all I'm saying. I hope they get together. I hope they kiss. But in any case, Wingmantle Chaplain, sometimes late in the game, it's just going to make like 8 birds, and then you win the game every time. But if we're going to make all those birds, we have to play a bunch of bad cards in our deck. So let's look at the defenders here and try to play as many not bad ones as we can, starting with 4 copies of Captive Weird and 4 copies of Clockwork Drawbridge. Now, these both have functions in the deck. First of all, they're very cheap. We have like a bunch of 1-drops in this thing, so we can get started on board super early, and both of these have early 3 toughness. Captive Weird can even block some stuff and just kill it in the early game, you know? Like if you're playing standard, your opponent drops a Savannah Alliance type thing, a recruitment officer or something, and you drop Captive Weird, they're just going to look at you like, oh no. You know, but Captive Weird can eventually effectively draw us a card. The deck needs a little bit of that. That's nice. And then Drawbridge, if we get into a situation where we are not having a great time board position-wise, and they have a huge guy, we just tap that guy down. So one of these is removal, the other is card advantage, and they are both 1-drops. That's actually these. And we're also playing 4 copies of Coastal Bulwark, a lot of bulwarks in this deck, and then 4 copies of Coral Colony, our sort of secondary win condition that you will never win a game with. There's going to be times where you're like, okay, got him down to 20 cards, I can do this, and you draw Wingmantle Chaplain, and it just makes like 10 birds, and you just win that way instead. I've never won with a Coral Colony. I'm not actually convinced this needs to be in the deck, but I did want a fun like alternate win condition, and this is a good one. And honestly, when it comes to this Bulwark, I really don't have a lot to say about it. It's just kind of a 2-mana 3/3 because we got a lot of islands in the deck. That's about all there is to it, to be honest. So let's move on to the non-creature stuff. We're playing 2 copies of Negate, 4 copies of Planar Disruption, and 2 copies of Borrowed Time. You know, sometimes we get to this part of the deck and I'm just like, yep, there's those cards. You know what they do and why they're here. And I just want to move on. But I will say Negate is mostly in there for in case we encounter sweepers. We're not trying to attack or get too aggressive or anything. But for both Chaplain and Coral Colony, we have to have a lot of defenders out. So it's nice to be able to counter sweepers. Aside from that, Planar Disruption and Borrowed Time are just extremely cheap and reasonably effective removal spells. But hey, everybody, look at the special fancy mana base. What got non-basics in it? Jeez, what do you think you are? You think you're better than me, mana base? We're playing 11 copies of Plaints, 9 copies of Island, and then 4 copies of Tranquil Grove. Because why not? We do have a lot of 1-drops in the deck that we'd like to play on turn 1, so we can't play too many tap lands or anything. But we're also not the most aggressive deck in the world, really. Like, we're not trying to win on turn 4 with attacking creatures, so I think that it's fine to play some tap lands. And as far as upgrades, just play Faithbound Judge. Faithbound Judge is actually really good because it's a card that's effectively an alternate win condition, but it's also a 4/4 flyer for 3 mana, and it's a really good deal when it comes right down to it. It's just a sweet little card if you want to add it, and it's not too expensive either. But you know what? I'm annoyed with myself. The excitement level's been a little too high on these last couple of decks. All happy and no slappy, so I think it's time to get a little bit toxic. Go Gary toxic, that is. That's right. You know there's going to be a toxic deck on this list because all these fools spending all this money on Venerable Rob Priests and March of the whatevers, and you're using all your rare wild cards. You don't have to do any of that. You can just play Toxic the way it's meant to be played and actually attack with your creatures instead of just targeting them with stuff. You can still win that way, and it's only a couple of bucks. Now, this deck starts with a platter of creatures that all sound like Monty Python insults. We got 4 copies of Bilious Skull Dweller, 4 copies of Blight Belly Rat, and 4 copies of Pestilence Pestilent Siphoner. There's just really, I feel like the whole Monty Python crew worked on these cards, but they're decent cards. Bilious Skull Dweller, I like to call him Billiam. He's actually really sweet on turn 1, and he's going to run down just about anything. You know, you play him on turn 1, and you're like, come on in, hot shot. You know, there's nobody wants to attack into Billiam, you know. But aside from that, Blight Belly Rat, the proliferate when it dies, is really sweet if your opponent has even a single poison counter. And then Pestilent Siphoner, this can get in 2-3 times a game before it's dealt with to actually give your opponent a fair number of poison counters by itself, pretty reliably. But that's not all. We're also playing 4 copies of Branch Blight Stalker and 4 copies of Necrogen Rot Priest to go ahead and finish the creatures off. Not a whole lot in the deck, but we actually don't need that many. Branch Blight Stalker has Toxic 2, and sometimes it gets through. If it doesn't get through in the early game, it usually takes out whatever blocked it. And as far as Rot Priest goes, there are scenarios where you can play this on turn 4 and win the game. It involves playing a whole bunch of creatures in the first 3 turns of the game, but it's actually not as hard as it looks to get this thing winning games on turn 4, and very easy to do it on turn 5. But if there's only 20 creatures in our deck that attacks for toxic damage, what are we doing with the rest of the slots? Hey, don't knock it. You know, Modern Infect, how many creatures they actually play. Our deck kind of feels like that. We've got 4 copies of Thirsting Roots in here, along with 4 Vraska's Fall and 4 Infectious Bite. Now, Thirsting Roots allows us to come down a little bit on the land count, which is nice, right? But it also just lets us proliferate for a single mana. This feels like a burn spell some of the time, you know? It's basically a shock in some ways, and that feels really nice. There's going to be times where your opponent really does not expect Thirsting Roots. They are at 9 poison counters, and they think you can't do nothing to them. You can just proliferate for a single mana. So this isn't going to win you the game a whole lot, but there's just enough utility here. And again, it kind of replaces some land slots. So I don't feel too guilty about playing this card as a playset in the main deck. But aside from that, Vraska's Fall and Infectious Bite are actually just like decently reliable removal. I know that Infectious Bite, there's not a whole lot of creatures in the deck that are of super high power. Cool thing about that is that we've got Necrogen Rot Priest to give things Death Touch. We have Bilious Skull Dweller over here that just has Death Touch, which is pretty nice, you know. But by giving them a poison counter is just sweet in and of itself. Vraska's Fall, giving them a poison counter, sweet too. So if we can't quite get through with all these creatures for enough combat damage, there's 3 spells on screen right here that once they do have poison counters, can either give them more or proliferate more onto them one way or the other. So sometimes, again, this is the reach in our deck. If we can't actually get through for combat damage anymore, we're going to lean on these to get those last few poison counters on our opponent. We're also playing 4 Anoint with Affliction and 2 copies of Necrogen Communion in here. Just a couple of copies of this, but it works so well on a number of our creatures. You know, even stuff like Bilious Skull Dweller, it can be great to put a Necrogen Communion on. This is basically going to get them through for a ton of toxic damage if they go unblocked. And if they do get blocked, a creature, again, like Skull Dweller, is going to take out whatever blocked it. And then come right back to deal a little bit more toxic the next turn, you know, or just block something again. So, like, just a sweet little card here that I don't want to overplay, but can be back-breaking if you put it on the right creature at the right time. Aside from that, Anoint with Affliction basically gives us, what, 12 removal spells in our aggro deck? Let's take advantage of that. More of them fancy pants lands in the mana base. When they gonna learn? But anyway, the fancy pants land in question here is Jungle Hollow, right? It's going to gain us some life. It's not bad. And I know that we don't need a whole lot of tap lands in this deck because we're trying to get Bilious Skull Dweller on turn 1. But we still have 10 Swamp to help us do that, along with the 8 Forests to just be forests. As far as the upgrades go, I guess you can add the Better Rot Priest if you want to. I'm not even sure about that, actually. Yes, I am. Let's not play those games. Green mana, 1 green mana Venerated Rot Priest is incredible, but here's the thing. Promise to me, this is the deal we're going to make, that if you do put in Rot Priest, you're not going to just put in a bunch of Tyvar stands and March of Burgeoning Life and blah, blah, and stuff that targets him. And then, no, we're an honest poison deck, and we attack for our poison counters around here. Please understand that. But I hope you guys are enjoying it because there's only one more deck. We've danced and played all night, and here we are, the last deck of the day. And it's actually not necessarily the one that I love the most. I don't know why I like the Defenders deck so much. It just kind of happened that way. It's a great deck. But this is maybe the deck that I am the most proud of because we have somehow found a way to build Oni Cult Anvil for $5 with some good cards. Now, it all starts with 4 copies of Ice Cauldron. That's Only Cold Anvil is the card that we're playing, but we're also playing 4 copies of Blood Tithe Harvester and 4 Voldaren Epicure. Obviously, Harvester and Epicure will both provide artifacts we can sacrifice to the Only Cold Anvil, or if we don't have our anvil out, those same artifacts will help us draw into the anvil, which is also a nice function. Putting bodies on the table is super sweet, and obviously, once we do get our anvil out, these cards effectively put 2 bodies on the table when you really think about it. So obviously this is the core of the deck, but there's a lot more to it than just that. You see, we're also playing 4 copies of Urabrask's Forge in this deck, along with 4 copies of Experimental Synthesizer and 4 copies of Sokinzen Smelter. I hardly know her. Yeah, it turns out that he who smelts it can dealt it 3 damage a turn. That was going somewhere at the start of it. I promised it was going to work, but ultimately, no. One way or the other, you can see what I'm getting at here. It is not very mana intensive to get a 3/1 every single turn with Smelter, and that is super reliable damage for just a couple of mana invested. Aside from that, Synthesizer is perhaps the absolute best artifact in Standard to sacrifice to an Only Cold Anvil, depending on when you've timed that interaction, but one way or the other, it is really sweet for only 1 mana to get Experimental Synthesizer, and this helps us get lands and little stuff and all that. Really sweet card, and it turns out one of the more expensive cards in the whole deck, but the actual most expensive card is this Urabrask Forge, which is so awesome with Only Cold Anvil. Basically, you live in the high life, right? I mean, Anvil on 2, Urabrask Forge on 3, you get a bigger creature every single turn, and you get fodder for Anvil every single turn as well. It just really doesn't get a whole lot better than this interaction. But here comes the weird stuff, because we're playing 3 copies of Forge Boss and 2 copies of Junkyard Genius. Genius looks so weird, but this is yet another body that provides us with an artifact when it comes into play, this time in the form of a Power Stone token, which can help us cast a, Urabrask Forge or whatever. That's cool. But mostly, this is just more artifact fodder for Only Cold Anvil and a body on the table. And, importantly, sometimes the ability to sacrifice something and kind of alpha strike off of it. Genius does a lot. But Forge Boss is my real best friend, man. Just look how sharp of a dresser this dude is, first of all. He looks great. But aside from that, this is going to deal a buttload of damage, and especially if we get multiple copies of them out. But even if we don't, we basically go from like pinging our opponent for a, piddly 1 damage a turn or whatever with Only Cold Anvil to now we're bolting them every turn, and that's something they have to take seriously. Forge Boss is pretty decent reach for a deck like this. And then we finish everything off with 4 copies of Voltage Surge and 3 copies of Hero's Downfall. We need a little bit of removal in this deck, and obviously we got a few extra artifacts laying around, especially with Urabrask Forge making 1 every turn for us, so Voltage Surge feels like a good call here. And then Hero's Downfall, look, we could play like Go for the Throat. We'd be slightly out of budget if we played like 3 copies of Go for the Throat, so that's a consideration. But there's other things we could play here, but Hero's Downfall takes out everything unconditionally, Planeswalkers included, which can be super important for a deck like this that doesn't have a whole lot of ways of attacking into them or otherwise killing them. So I'm just going Hero's Downfall here. I think it's the correct call. But here are the lands for this one, and would you look at that? Back to basics, baby. I like that. Just nice and clean. 13 Mountain. 11 Swamp. That's all you need to be happy. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we have done it. We have reached the end of yet another 5 for 5. It won't be another 1.5 or 2 years, God forbid, before we do another one of these. I know you guys like them. And I miss my budget people, man. Budget's still important to this day, and maybe even more important than it's ever been if you actually want to play paper Magic. So I love doing these videos a lot. I'm glad I got to do another one of them, and I hope you guys liked it too. And if you did, why don't you hit the thumbs up? That's what it's for. Aside from that, if you're really enjoying my content, you want me to make more of it, then you can check out the Patreon, linked in the description. All I really ask is $1 a month, and you can vote on content and stuff like that. That's why I'm doing this video right now. The patrons voted for it because, of course they did. Wouldn't you have voted for this? So let's not waste no time. Let's just get right down to it. Let's look over. I'm looking directly at you. Let's see what I pull when I look right at you. What are you good for? It's an ether. It is an ether vial. It's an ether vial. Everyone, has it not been quite some time since you've seen an ether vial? It's just a single mana for an artifact. At the beginning of your upkeep, you can put a charge counter on vial. You can tap it and put a creature card with converted mana cost equal to the number of charge counters on vial from your hand onto the battlefield. Does that not actually when you really think about it, completely break the rules of Magic. Oh, you can just play a free creature every single turn. Does that sound like a decent card for a very cheap amount of mana? Like, oh, actually, yes, it does. That sounds completely broken, as a matter of fact. And it was. Last thing I want to say here, though, is just a big hello to all the budget folk who mostly come around for the budget videos and not much else. I really appreciate that you came back for this one. You helped me build my channel in the early days, and I want to get back to doing more budget stuff for you guys, right? I'm actually working right now on a little budget Commander series because I'm a new Commander player who's just starting to get into the format, and I want to spend as little money as possible. And maybe that'll be a fun little thing to talk about because it's relevant to me at this point. Maybe you'll enjoy it. But one way or the other, I want to do more budget stuff here in the very near future. So come on back every now and again and see what we got cooking up in the kitchen. But aside from that, I got to leave now because, you know, Audacity says I've been recording for an hour and 56 minutes. Jeez. And I really don't know how long this SD card is going to record before it just stops. Probably not too much longer. So I'm going to get out of here. Love you guys. Thanks for stopping by. I've been Deb from The Place, and probably will still be that tomorrow. I'll catch you guys later. Thanks for watching, Wizards. Spread love and be kind.